The dust of 2 years on the trail had worked its way into Jedediah Stone's very bones. It was in the grain of the worn leather of his chaps, in the permanent squint of his eyes, and in the deep quiet that had settled over him after so many months of nothing but the lowing of cattle and the vast empty sky. As his horse, Balthazar, crested the final rise, Jed felt a familiar pull in his chest. Home. The word tasted strange, like water from a forgotten well. He'd left his small Wyoming homestead in the care of his aging uncle, Silas, and set off on a cattle drive that was meant to last 6 months, and ended up stretching into a 2-year odyssey of dust, danger, and dollars. He'd made his stake. Enough to buy a good bull, repair the barn roof, and maybe, just maybe, stop living a life dictated by the next long trail. He topped the ridge and reined Balthazar to a halt, his mouth falling slightly open. The breath he was about to take caught in his throat. This was not his land. Not the land he remembered, anyway. The familiar expanse of dry, stubborn grass and sun-baked earth was gone. In its place was something impossible. Neat, irrigated rows of green stretched out from the creek bed, a vibrant quilt of life stitched onto the dusty brown plains. He saw the dark leaves of squash plants, the feathery tops of carrots, the sturdy stalks of corn, and the bright red jewels of tomatoes hanging heavy on the vine. A series of small, clever ditches, lined with stones, diverted water from the creek with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. The air, which should have smelled of dust and sage, carried the sweet, loamy scent of turned earth and growing things. Jed's hand went instinctively to the Colt at his hip, a gesture born of long habit. His exhaustion was swept away by a tide of confusion and a sharp, protective anger. Someone was on his land. Not just passing through, not just squatting. They had transformed it, tamed it in a way he had never even considered.
He urged Balthazar down the slope, his eyes scanning for a camp, a wagon, anything that might explain the miracle or the trespass. He saw the small, familiar shape of his one-room cabin, the chimney puffing a thin, lazy trail of smoke. But it was the figure beside the cabin that made him pull up short once more, a woman. She was bent over, tending to a row of what looked like beans, her movements economical and graceful. She wore a dress the color of a deep blue evening sky, a garment that flowed and clung in ways he'd never seen. It was a single piece of fabric, slit up the side, and it seemed both entirely out of place and perfectly at home in the golden afternoon light. Her black hair was pinned up in a severe, intricate knot. Even from a distance, Jed could tell she wasn't from around here. As he got closer, the soft crunch of Balthazar's hooves on the gravelly soil made her look up. She straightened slowly, not with alarm, but with a kind of watchful stillness. She was Chinese.
Her face was a smooth, unreadable oval, her eyes dark and deep. She held a small hand trowel, and she did not drop it. She simply stood, watching him approach, a silent question in her posture. Jed swung down from his horse, his joints protesting the movement. He felt large and clumsy in the face of her quiet composure. The smell of stewing meat and ginger drifted from the cabin, a smell that made his stomach clench with a hunger he hadn't realized he possessed. "This is the Stone property," he said, his voice rusty, rougher than he intended. The woman nodded once, a small, bird-like motion. She said nothing. Her gaze flickered from his face to the brand on Balthazar's flank, then back to his face. "My property," Jed clarified, feeling the need to press the point. She tilted her head. Then she spoke, her voice soft, the words accented and carefully formed. "You are Jedediah?" The sound of his full name, spoken by this complete stranger in the middle of his transformed land, was the most jarring thing that had happened yet. "I am. And you are?" "Leanne," she said. Just that. She gestured with the trowel toward the cabin. "Silas." Gone. A cold fist closed around Jed's heart. He'd known it was a possibility. His uncle had been frail when he left. Letters had been few and far between. Gone where? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Leanne's eyes softened with something that looked like sympathy. She pointed toward a small, fenced-off patch of ground on a low hill overlooking the creek, a place where the wild roses grew thickest in the spring. A simple wooden cross stood there, new and clean against the blue sky. The anger drained out of Jed, leaving him hollow. He took off his hat, the dust of the trail puffing from the brim, and ran a hand through his matted hair. Silas was gone, and this woman, Leanne, was here. "I don't understand," he said, more to himself than to her. He looked from the neat grave to the impossible garden. "What is all this?" Leanne seemed to understand the sweep of his gesture. She wiped her hands on a cloth tucked into her waist and walked with measured steps into the cabin. Jed hesitated, then followed, his spurs ringing softly on the stone step he himself had laid 5 years prior. The inside of the cabin was as changed as the outside. It was scrupulously clean. The dusty bachelor chaos he remembered was gone, replaced by order. His rickety table was scrubbed smooth, a jar of wildflowers sitting in its center. His bunk had a new mattress stuffed with what smelled like fresh straw, and a colorful patched quilt was folded neatly at its foot. On a small shelf near the fireplace were a few delicate porcelain bowls and a small, well-tended shrine with a stick of incense burning. Leanne was standing by the table, holding a piece of paper. She held it out to him. It was a deed of lease, crudely written, but official-looking enough. It granted a 5-year lease of the 160-acre property and its water rights to one Leon Chin in exchange for a sum of $200. It was dated a year and a half ago, and at the bottom there was a signature. It was shaky, spidery, but it was meant to be his uncle's. Silas Stone. Jed sank onto a stool, the paper trembling in his hand. $200 for 5 years. It was a pittance, a joke. But it was more than that. It was a puzzle, and he was too tired, too grief-stricken to solve it. He looked at Leanne, who stood watching him with that unnerving calm. She had paid her money. She had done the work.
The proof was all around them, in the scent of the stew, the order of the cabin, the vibrant life teeming outside. But it was his land. His. The next morning, Jed rode into Harmony Creek. The town was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a land office that doubled as the sheriff's post. He needed answers. First, he went to the land office to confirm his deed was still filed and true. It was. The clerk, a young man with a green visor, confirmed the Stone homestead was registered solely to Jedediah Stone, inherited free and clear upon the confirmed death of Silas Stone. There was no record of any lease. As Jed stepped back into the blinding sunlight, a smooth voice called his name. "Jedediah Stone, as I live and breathe, we heard you were lost to the world." Alistair Finch stepped off the boardwalk, a broad, welcoming smile on his face. Finch was the town's most prosperous citizen.
He owned the bank, had a controlling interest in the freight company, and had made a fortune buying up land from desperate or discouraged homesteaders. He was always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rest of the town's working men. "Finch," Jed acknowledged, nodding. "Welcome home, my boy," Finch said, clapping him on the shoulder. "A tragedy about your uncle, a fine man. The whole town mourned." His eyes, the color of pale stones, held a calculating glint. "I trust you found your property in order." The question was too casual, too pointed. "There's a woman on my land," Jed said, watching Finch's face for a reaction. "A Chinese woman. Says she has a lease from my uncle." Finch's smile didn't waver, but something tightened around his eyes. Ah, yes, the squatter. A sad situation. Silas, in his final months, was not himself. Easily confused. Some unscrupulous characters took advantage, I'm afraid. You'll need to have the sheriff run her off, of course. A clear case of trespass. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. These people, you know, they move in, they multiply. Before you know it, the whole territory's overrun. Best to nip it in the bud. Finch's offer to help felt less like a kindness and more like a threat. He'd always wanted Jed's land, making no secret of his desire for its reliable creek. Now he was practically pushing Jed to create a conflict. I'll handle it, Jed said, his voice flat. Of course, Finch said, his smile returning. But if you find the situation untenable, you know my offer for your parcel still stands. In fact, given the trouble, I might even be persuaded to increase it, out of respect for your late uncle. Jed walked away without another word, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. Something was wrong. He returned to the homestead to find Leanne in the fields, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her from the afternoon sun. He felt like a stranger in his own home, an unwelcome observer. He spent the rest of the day in the barn, mending tack that didn't need mending, the smell of her cooking and the sight of her patient labor a constant, unsettling presence. Late that afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still. Jed knew the signs. He looked up from the bridle he was oiling and saw the clouds boiling over the mountains, dark and menacing. The first drops of rain were huge, cold, and splattered in the dust like coins. Then came the hail. It started small, like pebbles, then grew to the size of marbles, then acorns. A deafening roar filled the air as the ice hammered the tin roof of the barn. Jed's first thought was for the animals. He secured the door, then peered through a crack in the wood. What he saw made him forget the storm. Leanne was out in it. She was running between the rows of her precious garden, her blue dress soaked and clinging to her, her black hair coming loose. She was frantically trying to cover her most vulnerable plants with burlap sacks, her small frame buffeted by the wind and pelted by the ice. She was losing. For every plant she covered, 10 more were being shredded by the frozen onslaught. Without a second thought, Jed burst from the barn and ran into the storm.
The hail struck him like thrown rocks, stinging his face and shoulders. He reached her side, and she looked up, her face a mask of desperation, rain and tears mixing on her cheeks. He didn't say a word. He grabbed a pile of empty sacks from beside the cabin wall and started working alongside her. They moved in a frantic, unspoken rhythm. They shielded the delicate tomato plants, covered the broad leaves of the squash, their hands brushing, their shoulders bumping in the chaos. The roar of the storm was their only conversation. In that moment, it wasn't his land or her garden. It was just a piece of ground, and they were two people fighting with all they had to protect it. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world battered and glittering in the renewed sunlight. The ground was white with melting ice. Many of the plants were shredded, but many, thanks to their efforts, had survived. They stood, soaked, shivering, and bruised, in the middle of the ruined beauty.
Leanne's shoulders slumped. Jed saw the fight go out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. He had never felt more tired himself. She turned and walked back to the cabin, her movements stiff. Jed followed. Inside, she ignored her own shivering and immediately stoked the fire, putting a kettle on to boil. She handed him a dry towel, her eyes not quite meeting his. Then she busied herself making tea, her hands moving with a ritual grace that seemed to calm the very air in the room. As she handed him a steaming porcelain cup, his gaze fell on the small table where she ate her meals. The lease lay there, weighted down by a smooth river stone. He picked it up, the paper still slightly damp from the air. He looked at Silas's signature again. It was close, but the S was too flamboyant, the T not crossed with his uncle's usual decisiveness. It was a forgery. A decent one, but a fake nonetheless. Then he saw it, a detail he'd missed in his grief and anger the day before. Below his uncle's forged signature, under the line for witness, was another name, written in a confident, elegant script he recognized immediately. Alistair Finch. The tea in his cup suddenly seemed cold. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of ugly, simple greed. Finch knew Silas was dying. He knew Jed was 1,000 miles away. He'd found a vulnerable, hard-working woman with a little money and a lot of hope, sold her a worthless piece of paper, and planned to wait. He would let her do all the work, improve the land, prove its value. Then, when Jed returned, he would use the law and the town's prejudice to run her off, leaving the improved land ripe for the picking. Jed looked at Leanne. She was watching him, her dark eyes filled with a question she didn't know how to ask. He tapped Finch's name on the paper, then looked at her. He tried to find the words, but they wouldn't come. Instead, he used his hands. He made a gesture for money, rubbing his thumb and forefinger together. He pointed at her, then at the paper, then at Finch's name. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flicker of fear, then a deep, quiet sorrow. She went to a small, carved wooden box on the mantel. She opened it and showed him the inside. It was empty. She then held up 2 fingers for the $200, her life savings. She had given it all to Finch, believing she was buying a future. The injustice of it settled in Jed's gut like a lead weight. This woman had been robbed, not just of her money, but of her labor and her hope, and Alistair Finch had used his own family's name to do it. A hard knock on the door made them both jump. Jed opened it to find Finch standing on his porch, and beside him the town sheriff, a beefy man named Miller, whose loyalty to Finch was common knowledge. "Jedediah," Finch began, his voice oozing false sympathy, "I had a feeling you might be having some trouble. Sheriff Miller and I thought we'd come and help you resolve this unfortunate situation." He held up an official-looking document. "This is an eviction notice. Under Territorial Statute 7, agricultural leases to non-citizens are invalid without express county approval. A sad oversight on your uncle's part, no doubt. She has 24 hours to vacate the premises." The trap was sprung. It was all so neat, so legal. Finch had planned for every possibility. He expected Jed to be grateful, to see him as an ally, to let the sheriff escort this lone woman off his land and into penniless obscurity. Jed looked from Finch's smug face to the sheriff's impassive one, then back to Leanne. She stood behind him, small and silent, but he could feel her presence like a physical force. He saw the ruined garden through the open door, saw the cross on the hill, saw the empty wooden box.
He thought of the 2 years of dust and loneliness, and the feeling of coming home to something he didn't recognize but was beginning to understand. He stepped back from the doorway, positioning himself between the men and Leanne. "There's been a mistake, Sheriff," Jed said, his voice quiet but hard as ironwood. "This is my land, and this woman," he paused, the next words feeling both strange and absolutely right, "is my guest. Now, unless you have a warrant with my name on it, I suggest you get off my property. You're trespassing." Finch's smile finally vanished. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand dropping to his gun belt. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. Jed didn't flinch. He met Finch's cold stare with a steady one of his own. Finally, with a look of pure venom, Finch turned on his heel. "You'll regret this, Stone," he snarled. "Both of you." 3 months passed. They were months of armed truce. Jed and Leanne worked.
They repaired the hail damage, their shared labor a silent conversation. He learned the rhythm of her days, the way she talked to the plants, the quiet hum of a folk song she sang when she thought she was alone. She learned his habits, the way he liked his coffee, the deep stillness that fell over him when he watched the sunset. He taught her words: water, sun, good. She was a quick study. She pointed at the tools, the plants, the sky, and he would give her the name for it. In return, she showed him things he never knew about his own land. She showed him where the wild onions grew, how to find sweet roots by the creek, how to make a poultice from yarrow that eased the ache in his trail-worn knees. The cabin, once just a place to sleep, began to feel like a home. The land, once just a possession, became a partnership. The end came not with the law, but with fire and shadow. One night, a moonless night, Balthazar's nervous whinny woke Jed from a dead sleep.
He grabbed his rifle and slipped out the door. He saw them then, 3 dark shapes on horseback, carrying torches. Finch's thugs. They weren't there to talk. But Jed and Leanne had been expecting them. They had a plan, born of quiet evenings and sketched in the dirt floor of the barn. It was a plan built not on bullets, but on the land itself. As the riders approached the cabin, Jed, hidden in the rocks above, fired a single shot into the air. The riders scattered, shouting curses. 2 of them charged toward the barn, as expected. What they didn't know was that Jed had spent the previous day diverting one of Leanne's irrigation ditches. Their horses hit the newly saturated ground and sank to their hocks in thick, sucking mud. While they struggled, Leanne, a small, dark shadow herself, released the rope holding a series of tin cans filled with rocks they had strung between 2 trees. The unholy racket sent the 3rd rider's horse into a panic. It bucked him off and bolted into the night. The 2 men in the mud were easy pickings. Jed came down from the rocks, his rifle leveled. "Drop the torches," he commanded. One of them, a lanky man with a desperate face, did as he was told. "Finch sent us," he blurted out, his voice shaking. "Said to burn the whole place. Said the woman was a witch, and you was under her spell. He paid us half, with the other half on completion." In his terror, the whole sordid story came tumbling out. The fake lease, the plan to get the land, everything. Just then, another horse appeared, trotting up the lane. It was Sheriff Miller, arriving late, drawn by the gunshot. He sat on his horse, taking in the scene. Jed with his rifle, the 2 thugs stuck in the mud, and the small, determined figure of Leanne standing by the porch with a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hand, just in case. The sheriff heard the thug's panicked confession hanging in the night air. For the first time, Miller looked not at Jed, but at the evidence of a crime he could no longer ignore. A year later, Jed stood beside Leanne on the steps of the small clapboard church in Harmony Creek. He wore a clean shirt and a string tie, feeling awkward and stiff. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow cotton she had sewn herself. Her hair was down, falling in a dark sheet over her shoulders. They had just been married by the circuit preacher, with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. Alistair Finch was gone. The U.S. Marshal had taken him away in irons 2 months after that fateful night. His empire of whispers and fraudulent paper had crumbled. The town, free of his influence, had slowly, cautiously, begun to change its mind about the quiet Chinese woman and the stubborn cowboy who had defended her. People who once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to buy her perfect sweet carrots and crisp lettuces at the town market.
They walked back toward their wagon, not touching, but surrounded by a comfortable silence that was more intimate than any words. Jed looked out over the valley. From here, you could just see the patch of green that was their homestead. "The tomatoes are coming in strong," he said, his voice full of a quiet satisfaction he hadn't known was possible. Leanne looked up at him, and for the first time he saw her smile without reservation. It was a brilliant, beautiful thing, like the sun breaking through after a storm. "Yes," she said, her English now clear and confident. "Our tomatoes." He reached down and took her hand. Her fingers were small and strong, fitting perfectly in his. The dust of the trail was finally gone. he was home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button.
And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.